Picture this. It's 1976 at Orange County International Raceway. A beat-up Ford Fairlane pulls up to the line next to a pristine Chevelle with a tunnel ram setup and dual Holley 750s. That's 1500 CFM of carburation, thousands in engine work, chrome everywhere. The Ford, stock log manifold with what looks like a 2-barrel carburetor. The Chevelle driver actually laughs. Then the tree drops, and the Ford walks away like the Chevy's towing an anchor. This happened 43 times that season before anyone figured out what was going on. The carburetor arms race. The late 60s and early 70s were the golden age of stupid decisions made in pursuit of horsepower. If one 4-barrel carburetor made 400 horsepower, clearly two would make 800, right? Math doesn't work that way, but try telling that to someone who just dropped $3,000 on a tunnel ram setup. Holley absolutely dominated the performance carburetor market. The 4-barrel spread bore design was everywhere. Chevy used them. Ford used them. Even Chrysler eventually gave up on Carter and went Holley. If you were serious about going fast, you ran Holley, period. End of discussion. The advertising said so. The magazines said so. Every fast car at every drag strip said so. The aftermarket fed this frenzy like sharks in blood water. Bigger carburetors, more carburetors, specialty intakes to feed those carburetors. A decent dual-plane intake manifold cost $200 in 1975 money. A good 4-barrel Holley was another $300. Want to run a 6-pack or tunnel ram? Double it. And that's before you paid someone to actually tune the damn things. For working-class racers, this created an impossible barrier to entry. You could build a decent engine for maybe $1,000 if you did the work yourself, but the induction system cost almost as much as the entire bottom end. It was insane. And everyone just accepted it because, well, that's how it was done. Meanwhile, Ford had been quietly running what everyone called log manifolds on their FE and Windsor engines. These were cast-iron single-plane designs that looked agricultural compared to the sexy aluminum Edelbrock and Weiand manifolds everyone lusted after. They were heavy, they were ugly, they were old-fashioned. Nobody who knew anything about performance kept them on their engine. Except one guy. A Ford mechanic in Bakersfield, California, named Ray Henderson, who was either crazy or genius. Spoiler alert, he was both. Enter Ray Henderson. Ray Henderson wasn't your typical hot rodder. He didn't hang out at drive-ins or cruise Van Nuys Boulevard. He was a 43-year-old Korean War vet who ran a small Ford dealership service department and raced on weekends to supplement his income. His specialty was making budget builds competitive, mostly because he couldn't afford to do otherwise. Henderson had spent the 50s working at a Ford factory in Dearborn, specifically in the foundry where they cast intake manifolds. He understood how air moved through these things better than most engineers because he'd literally watched thousands get poured and finished. When he moved to California in '68, he brought with him a deep knowledge of Ford's casting methods and a basement full of rejected manifold cores. The discovery happened almost by accident in 1974. Henderson was building an FE motor for a customer who couldn't afford an aftermarket intake. Rather than just bolting on the stock log manifold and calling it a day, Henderson started examining the casting more carefully. He noticed something interesting about the runner design that everyone else had ignored. See, Ford's log manifolds had shorter, straighter runners than the fancy aftermarket pieces. Conventional wisdom said this was bad. Longer runners meant better torque, everyone knew that. But Henderson started thinking about velocity. What if shorter runners meant the fuel mixture hit the cylinder faster and more violently? He grabbed a hacksaw and started cutting. Removed material here, smoothed the transition there, matched the ports to some junkyard heads. Nothing fancy, just basic port work that took maybe 4 hours. Then he did something everyone said was idiotic. He bolted on a Motorcraft 2-barrel carburetor. Not even a fancy one. A stock piece off a 300-horse truck motor. His buddies at the shop thought he'd lost his mind. You can't make power with a 2-barrel. Everyone knows you need at least 600 CFM of carburation for serious horsepower. Henderson's setup flowed maybe 350 CFM on a good day. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight. Then he fired it up and the damn thing screamed. The dyno numbers made no sense. That little 2-barrel was feeding enough air for the engine to make horsepower numbers you'd expect from a dual quad setup. Henderson sat there staring at the printout, thinking either his dyno was broken or he'd stumbled onto something nobody else had figured out. The technical deep dive. Here's where it gets interesting. Henderson's trick wasn't just one modification. It was a system of small changes that worked together to completely outsmart conventional carburetor wisdom. And it all started with understanding what Ford had accidentally gotten right. The stock Ford log manifold had runners that were roughly 6 inches long from the plenum to the port face. Compare that to a typical Edelbrock Performer with runners that stretched nearly 12 inches. The conventional wisdom in 1975 was that longer runners created better velocity, a better fuel atomization, more power. Except, that's only half true. Longer runners do create velocity, but they also create restriction. They give the air-fuel mixture more opportunities to puddle, separate, and generally screw up before reaching the cylinder. Ford's short runners were actually more efficient at getting the mixture where it needed to go. The problem was the plenum design, and the transitions were rough as hell from the factory. Henderson's first modification was cutting away the plenum floor. The stock casting had this step design that was supposed to evenly distribute mixture to all 8 cylinders. In practice, it created turbulence and dead spots. Henderson ground it smooth, creating a gentle bowl shape that fed all runners equally. This took about an hour with a carbide burr and a die grinder. Next, he matched the intake ports to the cylinder heads. Not rocket science, but it mattered. Ford's quality control in the 70s was garbage. The intake ports and head ports often misaligned by as much as an 1/8 inch. Henderson would bolt the manifold to the heads, scribe the outline, then port match both sides. Another hour of work. But here's the genius part, the thing that made the whole system work. Henderson realized that the 2-barrel carburetors' smaller venturines created substantially higher air velocity than a big 4-barrel. Think about it. You've got the same amount of air demand from the engine, but you're forcing it through a smaller hole. Physics says velocity has to increase. Higher velocity meant better fuel atomization. Better atomization meant more complete combustion. More complete combustion meant more power from the same amount of fuel. The 4-barrel guys were drowning their engines in fuel that never fully burned. Henderson was running leaner, meaner, and somehow making more power. He proved this with temperature measurements. A typical Holley 650 setup would run intake manifold temperatures around 200 degrees Fahrenheit under load. Henderson's log manifold with the 2-barrel ran 160. That 30-degree difference meant denser air, more oxygen per cubic inch, more power. The physics was undeniable. The carburetor choice mattered too. Henderson specifically used Ford's Motorcraft 2100 series, a spread bore design with small primary ventures and larger secondary barrels. The primaries were tiny, maybe 1-inch diameter. This created insane velocity at part throttle. The secondaries, controlled by a vacuum actuator, only opened under heavy load. Most importantly, the whole setup stayed in tune. Big Holley 4-barrels were maintenance nightmares. Float levels changed with temperature. Accelerator pumps wore out. Secondary linkages needed constant adjustment. Henderson's 2-barrel had 7 moving parts total. You set it once and forgot about it for a season. The cost breakdown was hilarious. A used Ford log manifold from a junkyard, $20. Port work materials, maybe another 20. Motorcraft 2-barrel carburetor, also junkyard, $30. Total investment, $70. Compare that to the Holley alternative, new Edelbrock intake, $250. Holley 754 barrel, $350. Fuel lines, spacers, air cleaner that fits, another $100. You're at $700 minimum, 10 times Henderson's cost. The weight savings alone were worth mentioning. Henderson's setup with the cast iron log manifold still weighed less than an aluminum intake with a big Holley 4-barrel and all its linkage. The 2-barrel carburetor weighed maybe 6 pounds. A Holley 750, closer to 12. On the nose of the car, that weight mattered. Henderson also discovered that the log manifold's heat crossover passages, which everyone removed for performance, actually helped. They kept the plenum warm enough to prevent fuel from condensing. All those fancy aluminum manifolds, they'd pull raw gas in the corners that never made it to the cylinders. Henderson's iron manifold stayed warm, kept the fuel vaporized, and ran cleaner. The fuel economy was accidentally fantastic too. Henderson's race car got 14 miles per gallon at the track. Guys running big Holleys were seeing 8, maybe 9 if they were lucky. On pump gas at 60 cents a gallon, that difference added up fast over a season, but the real breakthrough was reliability. Henderson could run an entire season without touching his carburetor. The Holley guys? They were rebuilding carburetors between rounds, dealing with flooding, fighting vapor lock, adjusting jets constantly. Henderson would show up, make a pass, collect his winnings, and go home. No drama, no excuses, just consistent, repeatable performance from a $70 junkyard setup. Let that sink in for a moment. A working-class mechanic with hand tools and junkyard parts had figured out how to beat setups costing 10 times as much. And he did it by going completely against everything the performance industry said was correct. First tests and proof. Henderson's first official test was at Famoso Raceway in Bakersfield during 1975. He'd been testing at the shop on his dyno. An ancient Clayton unit he'd bought surplus from a truck shop, but dyno numbers meant nothing. Track numbers were truth. His competition that day was the usual Saturday night crowd, mostly small block Chevys with the works, Edelbrock intakes, Holley carburetors, headers, the full package. Most of these guys had $3,000 to $4,000 in their engines. Henderson had maybe $1,200 total, including his $70 intake setup. First pass down the track, Henderson ran a 13.4 at 103 miles per hour. Not spectacular by any means, but respectable for a bone stock FE motor. What shocked everyone was his consistency. Second pass, 13.4 again. Third pass, 13.4. Fourth, fifth, sixth passes all within 1/10 of a second. The Holley guys, they were all over the place. 13.21 pass, 13.8 the next. 14 flat because they fouled plugs. Back to 13.3 after rejetting. They were faster on their best passes, but they could never string together consistent numbers. Henderson started experimenting with ignition timing. With the better fuel atomization from the high-velocity intake, he found he could run substantially more advanced without detonation. Stock timing was around 32 degrees total. Henderson pushed it to 38, then 40, finally settling at 42 degrees. The dyno showed a gain of 35 horsepower just from timing alone. More importantly, he wasn't running race gas. Everything was pump premium, which in 1975 was still sold as 95 octane leaded. The Holley guys were mixing in 100 octane racing fuel just to keep their engines from destroying themselves. Henderson's setup was so efficient, it could handle the aggressive timing on straight pump gas. The dyno numbers started leaking out through the Bakersfield racing community. Henderson's modified 352 cubic inch FE motor was making 415 horsepower at 5,800 RPM. A comparable Chevy engine with a good Holley setup might make 430, but it needed 6,500 RPM to get there. Henderson's torque hue curve was also substantially flatter, meaning his engine was more drivable and easier on parts. By late 75, Henderson was winning regularly, not dominating, but consistent enough to make money. His car became known in the local scene as the Log, and people started asking questions. How was he running so fast with that agricultural-looking intake? What carburetor was he using? What was his secret? Henderson, to his credit, wasn't precious about it. He'd explain exactly what he did to anyone who asked. The problem was nobody believed him. It sounded too simple. There had to be more to it. Secret headwork, custom cam, nitrous, something. A $70 junkyard intake couldn't beat a $700 Holley setup. The laws of physics or marketing or something prevented that from being possible. But it was possible, and Henderson proved it week after week, track after track. His log manifold Ford became a local legend, and eventually word spread beyond Bakersfield. By 1976, people from all over California were showing up to watch this weird Ford embarrass properly built muscle cars. Industry and competitors' reaction. The aftermarket industry's reaction to Henderson's intake trick was predictably dismissive. When Hot Rod magazine got wind of the story in early 1976 and sent the writer to investigate, Holley's response was swift and condescending. A Holley engineering spokesperson told the magazine that Henderson's results were likely due to favorable atmospheric conditions and optimistic dyno calibration. They insisted that proper carburation required at least 1.5 CFM per horsepower. making Henderson's two-barrel setup theoretically impossible. The laws of thermodynamics simply wouldn't allow it. Edelbrock was slightly less diplomatic. Their head of R&D told reporters that log manifolds were agricultural technology from the 1940s, and anyone running them in serious competition was handicapping themselves. He suggested Henderson's competitors must have serious engine problems if they were losing to a stock Ford intake. Hot Rod's tech editor, though, was intrigued enough to actually visit Henderson's shop. They brought their own dyno, their own measuring equipment, their own fuel. They wanted to eliminate any possibility of shenanigans. Henderson welcomed the scrutiny. He had nothing to hide. The magazine's test results confirmed everything Henderson claimed. His modified log manifold produced more power than an equivalent Edelbrock Victor intake with a Holley 650. Not by much, maybe 5 horsepower, but enough to matter. More importantly, it was consistent across 20 pulls. The Holley setup varied by as much as 15 horsepower between runs. Hot Rod published the story in July 1976 with the headline, "Ford's Factory Intake Outperforms Holley Setup. How one mechanic's simple trick changes everything." It should have been a bombshell. Instead, it was largely ignored. The problem was advertising. Holley and Edelbrock were major hot rod advertisers. Within a month, both companies had pulled their ads and threatened to never return unless the magazine printed a retraction. Hot Rod, facing financial pressure, ran a follow-up story 3 months later suggesting that Henderson's results were difficult to replicate and not representative of typical performance. Henderson, watching this unfold, wasn't surprised. He'd seen how the industry worked. Innovation that threatened established profit centers got squashed, not celebrated. The aftermarket companies had too much invested in selling expensive intakes and carburetors to let some mechanic with junkyard parts undermine their business model. But Henderson had already won where it mattered, at the track. Other budget racers started replicating his modifications, first in Bakersfield, then across California, eventually spreading to Arizona and Nevada. It became known as the Henderson treatment, or sometimes just the log trick. Holley never officially acknowledged that velocity mattered more than volume. They couldn't, not without admitting their entire product line was potentially overkill for most applications. So they did what corporations do best. They ignored it publicly while quietly incorporating some of Henderson's principles into later designs. Racing scene. Adoption. By 1977, Henderson's trick had spread through the bracket racing community like wildfire. Not the professional ranks, mind you. The big names still ran big carburetors because sponsors demanded it. But working class racers who paid their own way, they were all over Henderson's log manifold setup. A mechanic in Phoenix named Tom Wilkins claimed he built 15 Henderson-style intakes in a single month. His customers reported immediate improvements not in peak power, but in consistency and reliability. They were winning more rounds simply because their cars ran the same every pass. The modification became so popular in Southern California that junkyard prices for Ford log manifolds tripled. What Henderson bought for $20 in '74 was selling for $60 by '78. Guys were pulling them off engines destined for the crusher and flipping them to racers. A whole cottage industry emerged around port, matching and modifying these old cast iron intakes. Henderson himself started offering a service where he'd modify manifolds for $50 plus the cost of the core. He could do 3 in a day working alone, making it decent side income. He claimed he modified over 300 manifolds between '76 and '80 before he got bored and stopped taking orders. The Ford versus Chevy tribal warfare got particularly heated. Chevy guys insisted that their engines made more power with proper Holley setups. Ford guys would point to Henderson's track wins and tell them to check the scoreboard. Drag strips saw some genuine animosity over this stupid intake manifold debate. A few enterprising individuals tried to commercialize Henderson's modifications. A company called Desert Manifolds in Tucson started offering pre-modified Ford log intakes for $250. They sold maybe 30 before Ford threatened legal action over trademark infringement. Apparently, modifying Ford's castings and selling them was problematic from an intellectual property standpoint. The technique also crossed over into other applications. Some guys started applying Henderson's principles to inline 6 manifolds with remarkable results. Others tried it on Mopar wedge motors with mixed success. The basic concept of velocity over volume started gaining traction beyond just Ford V8s. But the golden age was brief. Emissions regulations started getting serious by the late 70s. Smog requirements forced manufacturers to adopt completely different induction strategies. Carburetors themselves were on borrowed time. Electronic fuel injection was coming, and it would make all of this irrelevant. The science behind it. So, why did Henderson's trick work so well? The answer involves fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and a healthy dose of everyone else being wrong about basic physics. Carburetor airflow ratings. When Holley says a carburetor flows 650 CFM, they mean cubic feet per minute at a specific test pressure. That number sounds impressive, but it's largely meaningless in real-world applications. Your engine doesn't see test pressure. It sees atmospheric pressure minus whatever restriction exists in the induction path. A naturally aspirated engine can only consume air based on its displacement and RPM. The formula is simple. Cubic inches times RPM divided by 3,456 equals CFM required. Henderson's 352 cubic inch motor at 6,000 RPM needed about 630 CFM total, not per carburetor, total. Here's where it gets interesting. Henderson's 2-barrel only flowed 350 CFM at test pressure. That should have been inadequate, except test pressure is meaningless. What matters is the pressure differential the engine creates during the intake stroke. When you force 630 CFM of air through a 350 CFM carburetor, the velocity increases dramatically. Higher velocity means better fuel atomization. The fuel droplets get smaller, more evenly distributed, more likely to completely vaporize before entering the cylinder. Compare that to a Holley 750, flowing at only 85% capacity. The velocity is lower, the fuel atomization is worse, and a significant percentage of the fuel enters the cylinder as liquid droplets rather than vapor. Liquid fuel doesn't burn well. It pools in cylinder corners, washes down cylinder walls, dilutes the oil, and makes a mess. Henderson proved this with spark plug readings. His plugs showed perfect combustion colors, light tan to white depending on mixture. The Holley guys, their plugs were often dark, sooty, showing incomplete combustion despite theoretically having better carburation. The temperature differential also mattered enormously. Henderson's iron log manifold acted as a heat sink, maintaining steady temperatures that kept fuel vaporized. Aluminum intakes conducted heat differently, creating hot spots and cold spots that caused inconsistent mixture distribution. Ford's short runners, which everyone thought were a weakness, were actually an advantage. Shorter runners meant less time for fuel to drop out of suspension. The mixture spent maybe 20 milliseconds in Henderson's runners versus 40 milliseconds in a long runner aftermarket intake. That extra time allowed fuel separation, especially at part throttle. The physics of velocity versus volume is counterintuitive, which is why so many people got it wrong. More isn't always better. Sometimes restriction creates beneficial effects. The 2-barrel smaller Venturis created natural velocity stacks, accelerating the mixture before it reached the runners. Henderson also benefited from better mixture distribution. With 8 cylinders sharing a single 2-barrel carburetor, the distribution inherently favored uniformity. Tunnel ram setups with dual carburetors often had cylinders running radically different air-fuel ratios because one carburetor would flow differently than the other. The vacuum signal to the carburetor also improved with Henderson's setup. A smaller carburetor saw stronger vacuum signals, which meant better accelerator pump response, more precise metering, and smoother transitions from primary to secondary operation. Big Holley 4-barrels often had mushy throttle response because the vacuum signal was diluted across massive throttle bores. Modern computational fluid dynamics would later prove Henderson right. Engineers using CFD software to model intake manifold airflow found that velocity peaks at very specific restriction ratios. Too little restriction and velocity drops. Too much restriction and flow limitation kills power. Henderson had accidentally found the sweet spot through trial and error. The fuel economy advantage also came down to atomization. Henderson's setup was naturally leaner because more of the fuel actually burned. He could run 13:1 air-fuel ratios, where Holley guys needed 12:1 just to make the same power. That 10% fuel savings over a season added up to serious money. Reliability stemmed from simplicity. Fewer moving parts meant fewer failure points. A 2-barrel carburetor had about 40% fewer components than a 4-barrel. Less complexity equals better reliability. This should have been obvious, but the performance industry had convinced everyone that complexity was necessary for power. Henderson didn't invent any new physics. He just applied existing principles that everyone else had forgotten or ignored in their pursuit of bigger, more complicated, more expensive solutions. The slow death. The end came gradually, then suddenly. The Clean Air Act of 1970 really took effect in the late 70s, and carburetors of all types were on death row. California's emission standards became particularly draconian by 1980. Any vehicle registered in California needed to pass smog checks that many modified engines simply couldn't meet. Henderson's log manifold setup, despite its efficiency, still used a carburetor. Carburetors are fundamentally inefficient at precise mixture control. They work on pressure differentials and mechanical linkages, not computer-controlled precision. Electronic fuel injection could adjust mixture 60 times per second based on oxygen sensor feedback. No carburetor could compete with that. Ford introduced electronic fuel injection on the Lincoln in 1980. By '84, most new cars had fuel injection. The carburetor era was over. With it went the relevance of intake manifold tricks like Henderson's. Fuel injection needed specific manifold designs, with provisions for injector bungs, fuel rails, and sensors. Old log manifolds were incompatible. Holley, ironically, survived by pivoting to electronic fuel injection systems. They'd spent the late 70s fighting Henderson's simple carburetor trick, while completely missing the bigger threat. By the time they realized fuel injection was the future, they were years behind Bosch and other suppliers. They eventually caught up, but it was close. Henderson himself retired from racing in 1981. He was 50 years old, had nothing left to prove, and was tired of fighting emissions regulations that made his whole approach obsolete. He sold his shop, moved to Oregon, and as far as anyone knows, never worked on another intake manifold. His modified log manifolds lived on in racing applications where emissions didn't matter. Dirt track racing, offshore boat racing, tractor pulls. Anywhere carburetors were still legal, you'd occasionally see Henderson's trick being used. But the glory days were over. The last documented Henderson modified manifold sold on eBay in 2008 for $450. Some collector bought it as a piece of racing history. Whether they ever bolted it to an engine or just mounted it on the wall is unknown. Legacy and modern lessons. What can we learn from Ray Henderson's forgotten intake trick? Plenty, and most of it has nothing to do with carburetors. First, complexity doesn't equal performance. The entire aftermarket industry in the 70s was built on the premise that serious power required complicated, expensive components. Henderson proved that wrong with junkyard parts and a die grinder. This lesson keeps getting forgotten. Modern performance shops will sell you $5,000 intake manifolds with variable runner lengths and electronic actuators. Do you need them? Probably not. Second, physics doesn't care about marketing budgets. Holley spent millions on advertising, telling racers they needed specific CFM ratings and specific designs. Henderson understood airflow fundamentals better than their entire engineering department, not because he was smarter, but because he actually tested his theories instead of assuming the conventional wisdom was correct. Third, sometimes the solution is simpler than the problem. Henderson didn't invent anything. He just removed obstacles and let physics do its job. The log manifold was already a decent design. Ford's engineers had gotten the basics right decades earlier. Henderson just refined it by removing the rough edges. Fourth, the industry will fight disruption when it threatens profits. Hot Rod magazine backed down from their initial story because advertisers pressured them. This pattern repeats constantly. Any innovation that makes existing products obsolete faces institutional resistance from companies with inventory to move and marketing campaigns to protect. Fifth, working-class ingenuity often beats corporate engineering. Henderson wasn't an MIT graduate with access to supercomputers. He was a mechanic with hand tools and junkyard parts. But he had something corporate engineers often lack: freedom to experiment without worrying about quarterly earnings or product liability. The modern relevance is obvious if you look for it. Today's performance world is full of expensive solutions to problems that might not exist. Do you really need a $10,000 carbon fiber intake manifold? Or would a modified factory piece work just as well for 99% of applications? Henderson's story is also a reminder that automotive history is full of forgotten innovations. How many other simple tricks got buried because they threatened established industries? How many Ray Hendersons are out there right now, working in small shops, discovering things that big companies missed? The log manifold trick is gone now. Fuel injection made carburetors obsolete, which made intake manifold velocity tricks irrelevant. But the principle remains valid. Velocity matters more than volume. Simplicity beats complexity. Testing beats assumptions. These lessons transcend any specific technology. Maybe that's Henderson's real legacy. Not the specific modifications he made to Ford log manifolds, but the reminder that sometimes the best solution is the one nobody's selling. Sometimes the guy in the small shop knows more than the entire corporate engineering department. Sometimes simple works better than complicated. And sometimes, just sometimes, you can outsmart the big companies with nothing but physics, persistence, and a $70 junkyard intake manifold. You really, truly, absolutely cannot make this stuff up.